My name is Jessica, and I'm in my mid-30s now. Most people who meet me for the first time assume I'm the quiet one in the room, the one who listens more than she speaks, the one who smiles politely and lets louder personalities take the lead. They're not entirely wrong. For most of my life, I've worked in a field where patience matters more than volume. I'm an insurance risk assessor, which is a complicated way of saying I spend my days reading paperwork most people ignore. Property records, liability clauses, structural reports, inheritance documents, and the fine print that quietly decides who owns what when things go wrong. It's the kind of job where you learn something important very quickly. The truth is almost never where people assume it is. And if you're the type of person who doesn't interrupt, doesn't argue, and doesn't need to prove yourself in every conversation, people tend to forget you're paying attention at all. That's been my role in my family for as long as I can remember. Reliable, helpful, quiet. The cousin who organizes paperwork when someone dies. The one who knows where the keys are. The one people call when they can't find a document, but don't want to deal with the headache of looking for it themselves. What they never really noticed is that when you spend years being the person everyone hands their paperwork to, you start to see the entire picture. You see the history behind things people assume they understand. You see the details people skip because they think they already know the ending. And sometimes, you see a truth that nobody else realizes is sitting quietly in the background. That's exactly what happened with my grandfather's cabin. If you've ever had a family property, the kind that's been around for generations, you probably know the type of place I'm talking about. Old wood beams, a lake nearby, a place where cousins played when we were kids, and adults argued about repairs over coffee. For years after my grandfather passed away, the cabin mostly sat untouched. Not abandoned, but not exactly claimed either. At least that's what everyone believed, until one summer afternoon when my cousin decided to start renovating it. Without asking anyone, without checking anything, just trucks arriving, lumber stacked outside, contractors walking in and out like the place already belonged to him. At first, the rest of the family treated it like a minor family disagreement. But I remember the exact moment something felt off. Not dramatic, just a quiet professional instinct. The kind that comes from spending years reading documents nobody else reads. Because ownership, especially with old properties, is rarely as simple as people assume, and sometimes the only person who notices the difference between assumption and reality is the one everyone thinks is just quietly standing in the corner. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about humiliating anyone, and it definitely isn't about family drama for entertainment. It's about what happens when someone makes a decision based on confidence instead of facts. And what happens when the truth finally arrives, not in an argument, but in a phone call from an insurance agent. Before we go further, I'm curious about something. Have you ever watched someone make a big decision, completely convinced they were right, while you quietly knew something they didn't? In my family, I've always been known as the organized one. Not the loud one, not the dramatic one, not the cousin people tell exciting stories about at Thanksgiving, just the organized one. If someone needed help sorting through old paperwork, they called me. If Grandma couldn't remember where she put the property tax notice, I was the one who found it. If an old envelope showed up in a drawer with confusing legal language on it, someone would eventually slide it across the table toward me and say something like, "Jess, you're good with this stuff." It wasn't meant as a compliment exactly, more like a quiet acknowledgement that I was useful in ways that didn't make much noise. Growing up, my cousins filled the louder roles in the family. There was Mark, the confident one. The cousin who spoke first decided things quickly and rarely asked anyone's opinion before moving forward. Then there was Daniel, the easygoing one who laughed everything off, and a few others scattered across the family tree, each with their own personality, their own space in the dynamic. My place was different. I was the one people forgot was in the room until a practical problem appeared. And strangely enough, I didn't resent that. Not really. Because being the quiet one comes with a strange advantage. When people assume you're not competing with them, they stop being careful around you. They speak freely. They make assumptions out loud. They reveal what they believe about the world and about themselves. Over time, you start to see patterns. You see who actually reads the documents they sign, who listens during family discussions, who believes confidence is the same thing as correctness. Mark, for example, had always been the kind of person who assumed ownership of space. Not in a cruel way, just naturally. When we were kids visiting Grandpa's cabin by the lake, Mark was always the first one running down to the dock, announcing which rooms everyone should sleep in, deciding when we were going swimming. No one challenged him. Partly because he was older, partly because most of us didn't care enough to argue. But small habits have a way of growing into bigger ones. By the time we were adults, Mark had become the cousin who spoke about family matters as if he were quietly in charge of them. And most people let him. When Grandpa passed away 8 years ago, the cabin became one of those unresolved family topics. The kind nobody wanted to turn into a complicated conversation. It wasn't a mansion, just an old wooden place tucked between tall pines and a quiet lake. But it carried something heavier than market value. Memories, summers, family stories layered into the floorboards. So the cabin remained in limbo. Taxes were paid. Occasional maintenance happened. But no one formally stepped forward to claim responsibility. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. Whenever the topic came up at family gatherings, the conversation usually followed the same pattern. Someone would mention the roof needed repairs. Someone else would sigh about how expensive contractors were these days. And eventually, Mark would say something casual like, "Well, someone should really take charge of it eventually." The tone always sounded reasonable. Practical. Leadership even. And the rest of the room would nod in that familiar family way, where agreement is less about facts and more about avoiding uncomfortable discussions. During those conversations, I usually stayed quiet. Not because I didn't care, but because I had learned something while working in insurance. Ownership isn't decided in conversations. It's decided in documents. And documents rarely care about assumptions. At the time, though, none of that seemed urgent. The cabin sat quietly by the lake. The family carried on, and Mark continued speaking about the place as if, someday, it would naturally become his responsibility. No one corrected him. No one questioned the assumption. And I certainly didn't interrupt the conversation, because at that point in my life, I was still the cousin everyone believed was simply good with paperwork. The first time something about the cabin truly bothered me, it didn't happen during a big family meeting. It happened during a casual conversation at a barbecue. The kind of afternoon where nothing feels serious. Paper plates, grilled burgers, cousins talking over each other, while kids ran through the yard with melting popsicles. The cabin came up the way it usually did, almost accidentally. My aunt mentioned that the last winter storm had knocked down a few trees near the driveway. Someone else wondered if the dock needed repairs before summer. Normal concerns. The kind families talk about every year without actually making a decision. Then Mark said something that, at the time, everyone else seemed to accept immediately. "Well, I've been thinking about fixing the place up anyway," he said, flipping a burger on the grill like the conversation was already settled. "If I'm going to be the one taking care of it long term, it makes sense." The sentence was simple, casual, but something about it landed strangely in my mind. Not the renovation idea. That part made sense. The cabin did need work. It was the certainty in the way he said, "If I'm going to be the one taking care of it." As if that part had already been decided somewhere. Across the table, my aunt nodded slowly. "That would be nice," she said. "It would be good if someone in the family kept the place going." Daniel shrugged. "Yeah, Mark's always liked that place the most anyway." And just like that, the assumption quietly settled into the room. Not through an official decision, not through a legal discussion, just through the slow gravity of conversation. I remember sitting there with a paper cup in my hand, watching how easily the idea took shape. No one asked the obvious question: who actually owns it? Because in families, especially ones that have avoided conflict for years, people often accept the simplest story available. Mark likes the cabin. Mark is confident. Mark will probably take care of it. Story solved. From a distance, it even looked responsible. But my brain doesn't work the way most people's do when it comes to property. Years of reviewing claims had trained me to hear certain phrases differently. Taking care of it. Long term. Those phrases often show up in situations where ownership is still unclear. And unclear ownership is where expensive problems start. Still, I didn't say anything. Not because I didn't notice. Because I had learned something about family dynamics that's almost as important as legal paperwork. Correcting someone in front of everyone rarely changes their mind. It usually just creates a new argument. So I stayed quiet. But I also did something else. I made a mental note. Later that evening, when I got home, I opened the small leather document folder I kept in my office, the one my grandfather had given me years ago. Inside were a few scattered records connected to the cabin. Tax notices, old insurance paperwork, and some letters my grandfather had written. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic. But I remember sitting at my desk that night, looking at those papers, feeling the faintest sense that the conversation at the barbecue had skipped an important step. Not a scandal, not a secret, just a missing piece. At the time, though, it still didn't feel urgent enough to push the issue. Families make assumptions all the time. Most of them fade away without consequences. So I closed the folder, slid it back into my drawer, and let the moment pass. But the thing about small moments like that is that they rarely stay small. Sometimes they're just the first quiet signal that a much bigger misunderstanding is already beginning to grow. And in this case, the misunderstanding wasn't just about a cabin. It was about ownership, something Mark seemed completely certain about, and something no one else had actually verified. After that barbecue, the conversation about the cabin didn't disappear. It simply changed tone. Instead of being a vague family topic, it slowly started sounding like something that already had a direction. And the person steering that direction was always Mark. At first, it happened in small comments. A few weeks later, during a phone call with my aunt, she mentioned casually, "Mark said he might bring some contractors up to the cabin this fall just to look at things. Not ask, not discuss, just look at things." The way she said it made it sound harmless, almost helpful. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open, listening quietly. "Did everyone agree on that?" I asked gently. There was a short pause on the other end of the line. "Well, I mean, he's just checking the place out," she said. "It's not like he's doing anything yet." That word again. Yet. It wasn't a decision, but it sounded like the beginning of one. Over the next few months, the same pattern repeated. Mark mentioned the cabin in conversations as if he were already responsible for it. At a family dinner, he said something like, "If I redo the deck next year, we could all use it more." At Christmas, he joked about turning one of the back rooms into a small office space. No one challenged the language. People laughed. Someone said that sounded like a great idea. And slowly, the idea of Mark handling the cabin started to feel normal to everyone, including in a strange way me. Not because I believed the assumption, but because I understood something about how families work. Most people don't want to interrupt momentum. If a confident person begins speaking about something as if it's already settled, the rest of the group often just lets it happen. It's easier than opening a complicated conversation. Still, there were moments when Mark's comments crossed a line that only I seemed to notice. One afternoon, during a small family lunch, someone asked whether the property taxes had been paid that year. Mark waved his hand casually. "I'll deal with it," he said. The phrase wasn't aggressive, but it carried a quiet authority, like a manager assigning himself a task. I remember Daniel nodding and saying, "Yeah, that makes sense." I didn't say anything, but I felt something small shift inside me. Not anger, something quieter than that, a kind of awareness. Because the more Mark spoke about the cabin, the more his language began to rewrite the story. He wasn't just interested in the property anymore. In conversations, he was becoming the future owner. And the strangest part was how easily everyone else accepted the narrative, even when the details were vague, even when no official discussion had taken place. From the outside, it probably looked harmless. One cousin is stepping up to maintain an old family property. Responsible, practical. But from my perspective, something about the situation felt increasingly fragile. Not because Mark was renovating something that mattered to us, but because he was building confidence around an assumption that had never been tested. And assumptions around property tend to hold steady, right up until the moment they don't. I could have interrupted the conversations. I could have asked direct questions. But every time I considered it, I stopped myself. Not out of fear, out of observation. Because something about the way Mark spoke made it clear that he wasn't asking for approval anymore. He believed the decision was already his. And when someone reaches that level of certainty, arguing with them rarely changes anything. Reality usually has to do that on its own. So I stayed quiet. The same quiet cousin everyone expected me to be. Listening, watching, letting the conversations continue exactly the way they always had. Because at that point, I still believed this was just a family misunderstanding. One that would probably correct itself eventually. I didn't yet realize that Mark was about to take the one step that would turn a harmless assumption into something much harder to undo. By the time the next summer arrived, something about my place in the situation had quietly settled into a familiar pattern. Not because anyone formally decided it, but because families over time assign roles the same way water finds the lowest point in a landscape. Without discussion, without intention, just habit. In our family, Mark had become the decision maker about the cabin, and I had become something else. The support system, the person who helped with the details after the decisions were already spoken out loud. It showed up in small ways. One afternoon, Mark called me and asked if I could look over a contractor estimate he had received. "You're good with paperwork," he said casually. "Just tell me if anything looks weird." "Should I do this? Just look it over." I opened the document he emailed me. It was a fairly basic renovation estimate: deck repairs, roof reinforcement, and some interior updates. Nothing unusual. But as I read through it, something else caught my attention. The property address. The contractor had written it as owner Mark Reynolds. I stared at that line for a moment. It wasn't legally binding. Contractors often fill in ownership fields based on whoever contacted them. Still, seeing it written that way created a strange feeling in my chest. Not anger, more like a quiet confirmation of something I had already been sensing. The story Mark had been telling about the cabin had now moved beyond conversation. It was becoming paperwork. I called him back later that evening. "The estimate looks normal," I told him, "but the contractor listed you as the owner." Mark laughed lightly. "Yeah, I probably just said it that way when I called," he replied. "It's easier than explaining the whole family situation." His tone was relaxed, almost amused, like the detail wasn't worth thinking about. And maybe for him it wasn't. But for someone who worked in insurance, small labels like that mattered more than people realized. Because once an assumption enters official documents, it tends to grow roots. Still, I didn't challenge him. Instead, I heard myself say the same thing everyone else always said. "Just make sure everything's clear before you start anything major." He responded with easy confidence. "Don't worry, I've got it handled." That phrase again, "I've got it handled." After the call ended, I sat at my desk for a while, looking at the estimate on my screen. What struck me wasn't the renovation plans. It was how naturally everyone, including me, had accepted the role Mark expected us to play. He made decisions. We supported them. He spoke with certainty. We filled in the details. And I had quietly become the family document checker who helped make those plans smoother. Reliable, useful, invisible. From the outside, it probably looked like cooperation. But inside, something was slowly becoming clearer. Roles like that only work when everyone agrees on the same reality. And I wasn't entirely sure we did. Because every time Mark talked about the cabin, he spoke as if ownership was obvious. Already decided, already understood. But the more I thought about it, the more one quiet question kept returning to my mind. Not a dramatic question, just a practical one. The kind my job had trained me to ask automatically. What do the documents actually say? At the time, I still hadn't gone back to check. Maybe because part of me assumed Mark must have done that already. After all, if someone is confident enough to renovate a property, surely they've confirmed they actually own it, right? But not long after that conversation, something happened that finally made me open my grandfather's old document folder again. And that was the moment when the story everyone believed about the cabin started to feel a lot less certain. The moment everything began to shift didn't arrive with an argument. No raised voices, no dramatic confrontation, just a quiet afternoon and a single piece of paper. It was a Tuesday, and I had taken the day off work to catch up on a few things around my apartment. Laundry, emails, the kind of slow errands that fill the space when life isn't rushing. At some point during the afternoon, I opened the small drawer in my desk where I kept my grandfather's old leather document folder. I hadn't touched it in months, not because I was avoiding it, just because nothing had required it. But after my last conversation with Mark, the question had been sitting in the back of my mind more persistently. What do the documents actually say? That question tends to linger when you spend years working with legal records. So I pulled the folder out and set it on the desk. The leather had softened with age, the edges worn smooth from years of handling. I remembered my grandfather giving it to me shortly before he passed away. "You're the one who actually reads things," he had said with a quiet smile. At the time, I thought he was just joking. Now I wasn't so sure. Inside the folder were several familiar documents: old property tax notices, insurance records from years ago, a few handwritten notes my grandfather had made about maintenance issues, roof repairs, septic inspections, things like that. I flipped through them slowly, more out of curiosity than urgency, until I reached a document I had only glanced at once before. A copy of the property deed update was filed shortly before my grandfather died. The moment I saw it again, something about the wording made me pause. Not because it looked suspicious, because it looked deliberate. I leaned back in my chair and started reading it carefully, line by line. Legal documents have a rhythm to them. Once you've read enough of them, ownership transfers, trust structures, conditional clauses. At first glance, the deed seemed straightforward. The property had been placed into a family trust several years before my grandfather passed away. That part wasn't unusual. Many people do that to simplify inheritance. But as I continued reading, I noticed something that made me sit up a little straighter. The trust wasn't structured the way most family trusts are. Instead of assigning the property to a single heir or dividing ownership among several relatives, my grandfather had written a very specific clause, one that determined who had legal authority over the cabin. I read the sentence once, then again, and then a third time, just to be sure I wasn't misinterpreting it. The wording was clear, carefully chosen, and completely different from the assumption Mark and the rest of the family had been operating under. I remember staring at the page for a long moment, not feeling shocked, not even particularly emotional, just thoughtful, because suddenly the entire situation around the cabin looked different. Mark's confidence, the renovation plans, the casual way everyone had accepted his role. None of it matched what the documents actually described. For the first time since the barbecue months earlier, I felt a quiet sense of clarity settle in. Not excitement, not triumph, just understanding. The story the family had been telling itself about the cabin was incomplete, and the missing piece wasn't hidden. It had been sitting in this folder the entire time, waiting for someone to read it carefully. I closed the document and rested my hand on the leather cover for a moment. In that quiet room, one realization became impossible to ignore. Mark wasn't acting maliciously. He genuinely believed the cabin would eventually become his. But belief and legal structure are two very different things. And the clause my grandfather had written meant the situation was far more complicated than anyone realized, including Mark. For a few minutes, I considered calling someone, maybe my aunt, maybe even Mark himself. But something about the situation made me pause, because this wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. It was a fact, and facts have a strange way of revealing themselves, exactly when they're needed, sometimes without anyone having to announce them at all. After reading the deed that afternoon, I didn't call anyone. Not my aunt, not Daniel, and not Mark. Instead, I did something much quieter. I put the document back into the folder. For a few minutes, I just sat there at my desk, looking out the window at the slow afternoon light moving across the buildings outside. Because once you know a fact like that, the instinct is often to immediately correct the misunderstanding, to pick up the phone, to explain, to clear the air. But years working in insurance had taught me something very important about human behavior. People rarely accept information that contradicts a story they've already committed to, especially when that story has been repeated publicly for months. Mark had been talking about the cabin as if it were already his responsibility for nearly a year. Not aggressively, but consistently. Every conversation had reinforced the idea. Every renovation plan added confidence. If I suddenly stepped into that narrative and said, "Actually, that's not how the ownership works," it wouldn't sound like helpful information. It would sound like a challenge. And challenges, especially inside families, tend to create more heat than clarity. So I chose something else. I chose silence. Not the passive kind I had lived with most of my life. This time it was deliberate, because now I understood something no one else did. The documents already contained the answer, which meant the situation didn't actually require a debate. Reality would eventually introduce itself, and when it did, it would come from a place no one could argue with. Over the next few weeks, Mark's plans for the cabin continued moving forward. The conversations grew more detailed. One evening, he mentioned during a family group call that he was thinking about replacing the old windows. "They leak heat like crazy," he said. "If I'm going to start fixing the place up, I might as well do it right." No one objected. My aunt sounded relieved that someone was taking responsibility. Daniel joked about claiming the best bedroom once the renovations were done. And I listened quietly from my kitchen, stirring tea while the conversation flowed around me. At one point, Mark asked me directly, "Jess, you've dealt with property insurance before. Anything I should know before starting repairs?" For a moment, I considered answering differently. I could have mentioned the trust, the clause, the structure my grandfather had set up. But instead, I gave him the same kind of answer I might give any client asking about renovations. "Just make sure everything is documented," I said calmly, "and don't assume anything until you've confirmed it." He chuckled lightly. Yeah, I'll figure it out." There was no irritation in his voice, just confidence. The same confidence he had carried since the barbecue months earlier. And strangely, hearing it no longer made me uncomfortable, because silence had changed the way I saw the situation. Before reading the documents, staying quiet had felt like being overlooked. Now it felt like watching a story unfold that already had an ending written. Not by me, by my grandfather, by the trust, by the quiet lines of legal language most people never read. I wasn't waiting for a confrontation. I wasn't planning anything dramatic. I simply understood something Mark didn't. Ownership wasn't what he assumed. And eventually, someone else would discover that too. Not through an argument, not through a family meeting, but through the one place where assumptions always collide with reality. Paperwork. Official records, the kind that show up when people start making real decisions about property. At the time, though, Mark had no reason to question his plans. The contractors were scheduled to visit the cabin later that month, and as far as he knew, everything was moving exactly the way he expected. Once silence became a conscious choice, the way I observed the situation began to change. Not dramatically, just more carefully. For years, I had been the person people casually handed documents to. The cousin who checked forms, skimmed contracts, and quietly pointed out small errors no one else noticed. But now, instead of reacting to paperwork after decisions were made, I started paying attention to everything that happened before those decisions. Because Mark wasn't just talking about the cabin anymore, he was actively preparing to change it. Within a few weeks, I heard that 2 contractors had visited the property with him. They had taken measurements, looked at the roof, and inspected the deck that wrapped around the backside of the cabin facing the lake. Mark mentioned it during another family call, sounding pleased. "The place actually has good bones," he said. "It just needs some updates." Everyone seemed relieved to hear that. My aunt said she was happy someone was finally looking after the property. Daniel joked that maybe the cabin would finally stop smelling like damp wood and old fishing gear. The tone of the conversation was easy, optimistic, but while everyone else was reacting to the idea of renovations, my mind was following a slightly different path. Because renovation plans usually trigger something else. Insurance updates, permit applications, contractor liability forms. Those things almost always appear once construction work actually begins. And those things require documentation, real documentation. I didn't interfere with Mark's plans, but quietly, over the next few days, I did what I had been trained to do professionally. I reviewed the existing records connected to the cabin, the property tax filings. The last insurance policy was issued under my grandfather's name. The trust registration is attached to the deed. None of this required anything complicated. Most of it was public record, the kind of information anyone could access if they knew where to look. What I was really doing wasn't searching for a secret. I was confirming that the document I had read in my grandfather's folder matched the official filings. And it did. The structure of the trust was exactly the same. The clause I had noticed earlier appeared in every version of the document. Carefully written, legally binding, very clear about who had authority over decisions related to the cabin. Once I confirmed that, I stopped digging. Not because I had lost interest, because the answer was already complete. The rest of the situation was simply a matter of timing. Meanwhile, Mark continued moving forward with his plans. One evening, he sent a message to the family group chat with a few photos from the property. The images showed stacks of lumber near the driveway, a contractor examining the old railing along the deck, and the cabin itself, standing quietly among the tall pine trees. "Getting started soon," he wrote beneath the pictures. The responses came quickly. My aunt sent a thumbs-up emoji. Daniel asked if the dock would finally be repaired. Someone else commented that the place already looked better just having work done. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I studied the photos for a moment. The cabin looked exactly the way I remembered it. Weathered wood siding, the familiar slope of the roof. The lake is just visible through the trees behind it. It felt strange realizing how much confidence had grown around this renovation. Not because the project was large, because everyone involved believed the foundation of the decision was already settled. Mark believed he had the right to make changes. The contractors believed they were working for the future owner. The family believed someone responsible had finally taken charge. And no one, not one person in those conversations, had paused to verify the one detail that actually mattered: ownership. From my perspective, watching the situation unfold felt a little like watching someone build a house on land they hadn't fully surveyed. The structure might look solid at first, but if the boundaries are wrong, eventually, something will force a correction. Still, I didn't interrupt anything. I didn't send messages or warnings. I simply kept doing what I had been doing from the beginning. Observing, confirming, letting the situation move forward exactly the way Mark intended. Because the truth hidden inside that trust document wasn't fragile. It didn't need defending. All it required was the moment when someone involved in the renovation process asked the one question that had been missing since the very beginning. Who actually owns this property? And sooner or later, someone always asks. The moment when everything became absolutely clear didn't happen at the cabin. It happened in a place far less dramatic. My office. A quiet building in downtown Portland, where most days were spent reviewing files that no one outside the industry would ever find interesting. About a month after Mark posted those renovation photos, I received a call that initially sounded completely routine. It came from a colleague in our underwriting department. "Hey, Jess," she said, her voice casual. "Quick question about a property in Lake County. I think you might recognize the address." She read it out loud, and immediately I knew the place she meant, my grandfather's cabin. I leaned back in my chair slowly. "Why?" I asked. "Well," she said, scrolling through something on her screen. "Someone submitted a request to update the insurance policy for that property. Looks like they're planning renovation work." That part didn't surprise me. Construction projects almost always trigger insurance updates. What mattered more was the next sentence. The applicant listed himself as the owner. I didn't need to ask who. "Mark Reynolds," I said quietly. "Yeah," she replied. You know any, name." I paused for a moment, not because I was unsure of the answer, because I suddenly realized something important about this moment. Up until now, everything surrounding the cabin had existed inside family assumptions, conversations, plans, confidence. But this was different. Insurance updates require verification. Property ownership is one of the first things underwriters check. And the system she was reviewing didn't rely on family stories. It relied on official records. "What does the deed show?" I asked calmly. There was a brief pause while she pulled up the property file. Then I heard her say something that confirmed everything I had already discovered weeks earlier. "Huh." Another pause. "That's interesting." "What?" I asked. "Well," she said, her tone shifting slightly into the analytical voice insurance people use when they find something unexpected. "The property isn't registered to him." I waited. She continued scrolling through the record. "It's held under a trust, filed 8 years ago." "Yes," I said softly. "Looks like the trust assigns operational authority to..." She stopped reading for a second. "Jessica Miller." My own name? Even though I already knew what the document said, hearing it spoken out loud inside a professional system created a strange kind of clarity. The situation was no longer theoretical. It was official, not just in my grandfather's folder, in the property records, in the insurance database, everywhere that actually mattered. My colleague sounded mildly amused now. "So either your cousin filled out the form wrong," she said, "or someone in this situation misunderstood the ownership structure." I smiled faintly, though she couldn't see it over the phone. "That sounds about right. Do you want me to reject the update request?" she asked. Her question was practical, routine, but it carried a quiet weight, because that request represented the first moment Mark's assumptions had collided with the formal systems that govern property ownership. I thought about it for a moment, not emotionally, just carefully. "No," I said. "Hold it for verification." "Okay," she replied. "We'll request documentation confirming ownership before approving anything. Standard procedure. Nothing dramatic. Just paperwork doing exactly what it's designed to do." When the call ended, I sat at my desk for a long moment, staring at the blank computer screen in front of me. There was no excitement, no feeling of victory, just a calm understanding that the situation had reached a new stage. For months, Mark had been building plans around the cabin based on what he believed was true. But systems like insurance, permits, and property records don't move forward on belief. They move forward on documentation. And now, somewhere in the process of preparing renovations, Mark was about to encounter the same line of text I had read weeks earlier. The clause that explained who actually had authority over the property. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, in black ink, exactly where it had been all along. After the call with my colleague ended, I didn't immediately return to work. Instead, I sat there for a while, looking at the quiet order of my desk. The neat stack of files, my coffee mug, the leather document folder resting in the corner. For the first time since discovering the trust clause, I understood that the situation around the cabin had reached a decision point. Not for Mark, for me. Up until now, I had simply been observing, confirming facts, letting the situation unfold without interference. But now the systems outside the family had entered the story. Insurance verification, property records, official documentation. And those systems would soon ask Mark the same question my colleague had asked me earlier. "Can you prove you own this property?" I knew exactly how that process would go. First, the request for documentation. Then the comparison with the recorded deed. Then the realization that the ownership structure wasn't what he believed. The only question left was whether I wanted to step in before that moment arrived. I considered a few different options. The most obvious one was to call Mark directly. Explain the trust. Tell him what I had found. Give him the chance to adjust his plans before any paperwork forces the issue. From the outside, that would probably seem like the kindest path, the most cooperative. But when I imagined that conversation, something about it felt complicated, not hostile, just predictable. Mark had spent nearly a year speaking about the cabin, as if its future already belonged to him. He had visited contractors, made plans, presented the renovation as a responsible step for the family. If I suddenly told him that the legal structure said otherwise, the conversation would almost certainly turn into a debate. Not about documents, about interpretation, about fairness, about what Grandpa probably meant. I had seen those kinds of discussions happen before. They rarely ended with clarity. Another option was to call a family meeting, bring everyone together, lay out the documents, explain the trust clause calmly. But that approach carried its own problems. Group conversations often amplify emotion rather than understanding. Someone would feel blindsided. Someone else would try to smooth things over. The focus would shift away from the facts and toward the feelings surrounding them. And the truth about legal documents is simple. They don't change because a room full of people wishes they did. So I kept thinking. Eventually, my mind settled on a third option, one that felt strangely consistent with everything that had happened so far. I would do nothing, not out of indifference. Out of respect for the process already in motion, Mark had initiated a renovation project. That project had triggered an insurance update, and the insurance system was now doing exactly what it was designed to do: verify ownership. If I intervened now, the situation would become a personal disagreement. If I stayed silent, the truth would emerge from an objective source. No accusations, no debates, just paperwork. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly. The decision felt surprisingly calm, not passive, just final. Because once official systems begin asking questions about property ownership, the outcome becomes almost inevitable. Documents either confirm the assumption or they correct it. And whichever result appears, it doesn't belong to any single person. It belongs to the record. Somewhere out there, Mark was probably still planning the renovation schedule, maybe talking to contractors, maybe picturing the cabin after the updates were finished. He had no reason to expect a problem. After all, the story he believed had been reinforced for months. But within a few days, the insurance office would send a simple request. A standard email. One question. One requirement. Please provide documentation confirming property ownership. And when Mark opened that message, the story surrounding the cabin would finally meet the one thing it had avoided since the very beginning: verification. Once I made the decision not to intervene, the situation settled into a quiet waiting period. Nothing dramatic changed at first. The family group chat still carried the same light conversations it always had. Mark occasionally shared updates about the cabin, measurements taken, materials ordered, and small details about the work he planned to start once everything was finalized. From the outside, everything looked exactly the same. But behind the scenes, a few things had begun moving in ways no one in the family could see. A few days after my colleague called, the insurance department sent the verification request to Mark. It was a standard message. Professional, polite, something like, "Before approving the renovation-related coverage update, please provide documentation confirming ownership or legal authority over the property." Nothing accusatory, just a routine procedure. I didn't ask my colleague when exactly Mark received it. I didn't check the system logs. That would have crossed a line between observation and interference. Instead, I continued going about my normal work days. Meetings, reports, the quiet rhythm of reviewing claims and evaluating risk assessments. Still, there was a certain awareness in the back of my mind that somewhere in Mark's inbox, that message was waiting. And eventually, he would open it. About 4 days later, something small happened that suggested the moment had arrived. I was cooking dinner when my phone buzzed with a new message in the family group chat. It was from Mark. The text itself was short. "Hey, quick question. Does anyone have the original cabin paperwork from Grandpa? I'm trying to track down the deed." For a moment, I simply looked at the message on the screen. Around it, the familiar little typing bubbles began appearing as different family members responded. My aunt wrote that she thought most of Grandpa's documents had been sorted years ago. Daniel said he didn't remember seeing anything like that. Someone else guessed that the paperwork might still be stored somewhere in the old filing cabinet at the cabin itself. The conversation stayed casual, curious. No one seemed worried, but I recognized the question immediately, because people usually start looking for the deed after someone asks them to prove ownership. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I finished making dinner, set the pan aside, and poured myself a glass of water. Only after a few minutes did I type a short response. I might have some copies in Grandpa's folder. I'll check. Nothing more. Just a factual answer. A few seconds later, Mark reacted with a thumbs up emoji. Thanks, Jess, he wrote. Appreciate it. The conversation moved on to other topics soon after. Someone mentioned an upcoming birthday. Daniel sent a photo of his dog. The normal rhythm of family messages returned. But beneath that ordinary surface, the situation had clearly shifted. For the first time since he began planning renovations, Mark had encountered something he hadn't expected. A request for proof. And now he was doing what anyone in that situation would do. Looking for documents. Looking for confirmation that the story he believed about the cabin was actually supported by paperwork. Meanwhile, sitting quietly in my office drawer, my grandfather's leather folder already contained the answer he was searching for. The same clause. The same trust structure. The same carefully written line assigning authority over the property. At some point soon, Mark would see it. Not through speculation. Not through family discussion. Through the same document I had read weeks earlier. And when that moment arrived, the renovation plans, the contractors, and the assumptions built over the past year would all be forced to adjust to one simple fact. Ownership wasn't what he assumed. The next few days after Mark asked about the cabin paperwork were quiet, at least on the surface. In the family group chat, conversations continued like normal. Photos of weekend hikes, someone sharing a recipe. My aunt asked if anyone was free to help her move some furniture. But Mark didn't mention the cabin again. Not immediately! And that silence told me more than any message could have. Because when someone is suddenly searching for documents they thought they wouldn't need, it usually means they've started encountering questions they weren't prepared for. About 3 days later, my phone rang in the middle of the afternoon. Mark's name appeared on the screen. For a moment, I simply watched it ring. Then I answered. "Hey, Jess," he said. His voice sounded calm, but there was something underneath it. Not panic exactly, just a slightly tighter tone than usual. "Hey," I replied. "So, I've been going through some paperwork about the cabin," he said slowly. I waited, and I realized I might not have the full picture about how Grandpa set things up. That sentence hung in the air for a moment. Not accusatory, not defensive, just uncertain. "What do you mean?" I asked gently. "Well," he continued, exhaling quietly. "The insurance company asked for proof of ownership before approving the renovation coverage. There it was, the moment I had expected. And when I started looking for the deed, I couldn't find anything that actually lists me." His words came carefully now, as if he were still trying to organize the situation in his own mind. "I always thought Grandpa intended the cabin to go to me eventually," he added. The phrase was intended to stand out. It's a common phrase people use when expectations meet legal documents, because intentions and legal structures don't always align. "I have a copy of the trust documents," I said calmly. There was a short pause on the other end of the line. "You do?" "Yes." Another pause. "Could you send them to me?" His voice carried a different energy now. Still controlled. But the easy certainty he had always had when talking about the cabin was gone. It had been replaced with something more careful. We didn't argue. We didn't debate. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Before we hung up, Mark thanked me again for checking. But when the call ended, I could already sense the shift happening. Because the moment someone realizes they may not fully understand the legal structure behind a property, their relationship to that property changes. Confidence turns into investigation. Assumptions turn into questions. That evening, I scanned the trust document from my grandfather's folder and emailed it to Mark. No commentary, no explanation, just the file itself, the same document I had read weeks earlier. Somewhere on the other end of the internet, Mark would soon open it. He would read through the legal language, the transfer structure, and eventually, he would reach the same line that had made me sit up in my chair that quiet Tuesday afternoon. The clause assigning operational authority. The name was written there. My name. I didn't know exactly how long it would take him to process what it meant. But I did know one thing. Once someone sees that kind of clause in writing, the story they've been telling themselves about ownership becomes much harder to maintain. And from that moment forward, the renovation project, the contractors, and the plans he had been discussing for months would all begin to feel very different. Not because anyone had argued with him, because the documents had answered the question he hadn't realized he needed to ask. Mark didn't respond to my email that evening, or the next morning. At first, that silence didn't surprise me. Trust documents aren't the kind of thing people read quickly. The language is dense, the clauses layered in ways that require patience to understand. Even people who work with legal paperwork regularly often have to slow down and read it twice. Still, by the second day, the quiet had a different quality. Not avoidance, processing. Because once someone opens a document expecting confirmation, and instead finds something that contradicts their assumptions, the mind tends to move through a series of quiet questions. Did I misunderstand this? Maybe there's another page. Maybe this clause means something different from what it sounds. Those are normal reactions. I know them well, because I've watched countless property owners experience that same moment when reviewing liability structures after a claim. The document doesn't shout. It simply states what is already true. Late on the second evening, my phone finally rang again. Mark. I stepped onto my balcony before answering. Hey, he said. His voice sounded different this time, not tense, just steadier in a way that suggested he had already reached some conclusions of his own. Hey, I replied. I read the trust, he said. I waited. There was a short pause before he continued. I didn't realize Grandpa structured it like that. His words were careful now, measured. Most people wouldn't, I said quietly. Another pause. So the operational authority, he said slowly, that's you. It wasn't a question, more like a statement he was still adjusting to. Yes, for a moment, the only sound between us was the faint evening wind moving through the trees near my building. I guess I should have checked the paperwork before making plans, he said after a while. There was no anger in his voice, just recognition, because once the documents are clear, there isn't really an argument to have. Legal structures don't bend to personal expectations. I wasn't trying to take anything from anyone, he added. I know. And I meant it. Mark had never sounded like someone trying to steal a family property. He had sounded like someone who believed a story that had quietly formed around him over the years. The cousin who loved the cabin the most. The one who spoke confidently about maintaining it. The one everyone assumed would eventually take responsibility. Those assumptions had slowly hardened into something that felt like certainty. But the trust had been written long before those conversations ever happened. About the contractors, he said carefully, I've already scheduled some of the work. That detail mattered. Because construction plans don't exist in isolation. Permits, insurance updates, material orders, all of those things connect to official records. I'll need to pause everything until this is sorted out, he continued. It sounded like he had already begun that process. That's probably why, I said. We didn't discuss blame. We didn't discuss family politics. Just the practical reality of the situation. The renovations he had been preparing for months could not move forward the way he expected. Not because someone had stopped him, because the structure governing the property had never given him that authority in the first place. By the time the call ended, the situation had become something quieter than conflict. Recognition. Not dramatic. Just the slow adjustment that happens when someone realizes the path they've been walking isn't the one the map actually shows. And once that realization settles in, there's no way to simply pretend it didn't happen. A few days after our phone call, Mark suggested we meet at the cabin. Not for a family gathering, just the two of us. His message was simple. I think it would be good to talk in person. The following Saturday, I drove the familiar road that curved through the pine forest toward the lake. It had been a long time since I had visited the cabin alone. The place looked almost exactly the same as it always had. Tall trees stand quietly around the clearing. The old wooden siding was weathered by years of rain and sun. A few stacks of lumber were still sitting near the driveway where Mark's contractors had left them. Evidence of plans that had paused mid-motion. Mark was already there when I arrived. He was standing on the deck facing the lake, hands resting lightly on the railing that still needed repairs. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The water was calm that morning, reflecting the pale sky in long, quiet ripples. Finally, Mark turned toward me. I should have checked the documents first, he said. There was no defensiveness in his tone, just acceptance. Most people don't think about trust structures until they have to, I replied. He nodded slightly. I think I convinced myself that because Grandpa and I spent so much time here, it would naturally become my responsibility. That explanation made sense. Family properties carry emotional history, and sometimes people interpret that history as a kind of informal promise. But informal promises don't override written documents. I wasn't trying to take control of something that wasn't mine, he added. I know, I said again. And I did. If anything, Mark had simply followed the role the family had quietly allowed him to believe he held. We walked slowly across the deck together, the wood creaking under our steps. The cabin smelled the same as it always had: pine, lake air, and old wood warmed by sunlight. Mark gestured towards the stacked lumber near the driveway. "I've already told the contractors to pause the work," he said. "That's probably the right call," I replied. Another quiet moment passed. Then he asked the question that had been sitting between us since the beginning. "So what happens now?" I looked out across the lake before answering. "The trust gives operational authority to one person," I said calmly. "But it doesn't prevent the cabin from being used by the family." Mark absorbed that for a moment. "So the place doesn't have to change hands for improvements to happen?" "No," I said. "But decisions about the property have to follow the structure Grandpa put in place." He nodded slowly. The conversation never turned heated. No raised voices, no accusations. Just two adults standing in the quiet space between expectation and reality. Eventually, Mark gave a small, thoughtful smile. "You know," he said, "if anyone in the family was going to end up in charge of the paperwork around this place, it makes sense that it's you." I laughed softly. "That's been my role for a long time." He looked around the cabin one more time. The lake, the trees, the quiet structure that had held our family memories for decades. "Well," he said, "at least now we know what the map actually looks like." And sometimes that's all a confrontation really needs to be. Not a battle, just a moment where the truth is finally spoken out loud. In the weeks after that conversation at the cabin, something subtle changed in the way the family talked about the place. Not dramatically, no formal announcement, no long explanations, just a quiet adjustment in tone. When the cabin came up in conversation again, people no longer spoke about it as if Mark were naturally taking it over. Instead, the language shifted towards something more accurate. "Jess, what do you think about repairing the dock?" "Jessica, should we look at updating the insurance for the winter?" Small things like that. The kind of change that happens when people slowly update their understanding of a situation. Interestingly, Mark was the one who made the adjustment easiest for everyone else. During one family call, my aunt mentioned that she hoped the cabin would still get some repairs done before the next summer. Mark answered before I could. "Jess is handling the property decisions now," he said casually. "But I'm still happy to help with the work." His voice didn't carry resentment, just clarity. And once he said it out loud, the rest of the family accepted it almost immediately. Because the truth, once explained simply, tends to settle into place more easily than people expect. For me, the change felt strange at first. Not because I wanted control over the property, but for most of my life, my role had been quiet support. The person who organized documents, the one who confirmed details after others had already made decisions. Now the situation had shifted slightly. The documents had simply revealed what my grandfather had already planned years earlier. Authority over the cabin had never been about personality, or confidence, or who spoke first during family conversations. It had been about trust. Literally and figuratively, my grandfather had placed the property inside a structure designed to protect it from misunderstandings. And he had assigned responsibility to the person he believed would treat the cabin carefully. Someone who reads things thoroughly. Someone who didn't rush decisions. Someone who understood that property isn't just about ownership. It's about stewardship. That realization didn't make me feel powerful. If anything, it made me feel more thoughtful about the role. Because cabins like this aren't just assets. They're containers of memory. Every mark in the wood, every creak in the floorboards, every faded fishing photo hanging on the wall carries a piece of family history. The goal isn't to control that history. It's to protect it long enough for the next generation to experience it too. A few months later, Mark and I worked together to schedule a smaller set of repairs for the cabin. Nothing extravagant, just the things that actually mattered. Stabilizing the deck, fixing the roof before winter, updating the insurance properly this time. The work moved forward quietly. No announcements. No big declarations. Just make careful decisions one step at a time. Looking back now, the whole situation taught me something I hadn't fully understood before. Being underestimated isn't always a disadvantage. Sometimes it simply means people don't notice the quiet responsibilities you've already been carrying. And sometimes the truth about who holds those responsibilities is written long before anyone realizes it. Looking back now, the story of the cabin was never really about a renovation. And it wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about something much quieter than that. Assumptions. In families, and honestly, in life in general, people often build entire narratives around what they believe must be true. Someone speaks with confidence, others nod along. Over time, that confidence slowly turns into a shared story. And once a story settles into place, very few people stop to check whether the foundation underneath it is actually solid. That's what happened with the cabin. Mark believed he would eventually take responsibility for it. The rest of the family gradually accepted that idea. And because no one questioned it early on, the assumption grew stronger every time it was repeated. But the interesting thing about documents, real legal documents, is that they don't care about assumptions. They don't adjust themselves based on who sounds the most confident in a conversation. They simply record what was decided at the moment they were written. My grandfather understood that. He didn't leave the future of the cabin up to family debates or unspoken expectations. He created a structure, a quiet one, and then he trusted that when the time came, someone would read it carefully enough to understand what he had intended. What I learned from that experience isn't something dramatic. It's actually very simple. Confidence can guide conversations, but documentation guides reality. And when the two don't match, reality eventually wins, usually through something very ordinary. A request for paperwork, a clause someone forgot to read, or sometimes just a phone call from an insurance agent. The good news is that once the truth becomes clear, most situations don't need anger or conflict to resolve themselves. They just need people willing to accept what the facts already say. Today, the cabin still stands by the lake, exactly where it has been for decades. Family still visits. The dock still creaks when someone steps on it. And every summer evening, the light still moves across the water the same way it did when we were kids. The only real difference now is that everyone understands the structure behind it. Not because someone argued louder, but because someone finally checked the paperwork. And that makes me curious about something. Have you ever seen a situation where everyone believed something was true until a single document proved otherwise? I'd really love to hear your story in the comments.
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.